Susan, a woman hardened by life on the streets, stumbles upon Harold, an elderly man lost and vulnerable in the cold city night. Her act of kindness leads to an unexpected offer, tragic family secrets, and surprises she never imagined. The wind was particularly harsh that evening, slicing through the city streets with a bite that made even the most hardened souls shiver. Susan pulled her worn coat tighter around her shoulders, her hands buried deep in the pockets as she made her way down the familiar, dimly lit alley. The scent of rain hung in the air, a promise of another cold, wet night on the streets. Just as she rounded the corner by the old bakery, she saw him, an elderly man standing alone, his posture stiff with confusion. He was well dressed, his wool coat neatly buttoned, but there was something vulnerable in the way he clutched a folded piece of paper, his eyes darting around as if he were lost in a maze. He didn't belong here, that much was clear. Susan hesitated. Years on the streets had taught her to be wary, to avoid unnecessary entanglements. But there was something in his expression, a flicker of panic, that tugged at her. She took a deep breath, stepping forward. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked gently, trying not to startle him. The old man turned toward her, his eyes wide and clouded with uncertainty. I seem to have lost my way," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I was supposed to meet my son, but I don't know where I am." Susan glanced at the paper in his hand. It was an address, scrawled in a neat, steady hand, clearly not his own. She recognized the street. It wasn't far, but it was easy to see how someone unfamiliar could get turned around, especially in the dark. "I know where that is," she said softly. "I can take you there." Relief washed over his face, and he nodded, his grip on the paper relaxing just a bit. "Thank you," he murmured. "I don't know what I would have done." Susan gave him a small smile, leading him out of the alley and onto the main street. As they walked, he tried to make conversation, but it was clear his thoughts were elsewhere, his words trailing off as he looked around nervously. She learned his name was Harold, and that he had just moved to the city to be closer to his son. But the rest of his story was fragmented, his mind slipping like sand through fingers. When they finally reached the building, an imposing structure with a doorman who eyed Susan suspiciously, Harold sighed with relief. "This is it," he said, his voice steadier now. The doorman stepped forward, already opening the door. "Mr. Hargrove, we were getting worried," he said, his tone a mix of professionalism and concern. "Your son's been looking for you." Harold nodded absent-mindedly, but before he stepped inside, he turned back to Susan. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills, pressing them into her hand. "Please, take this," he insisted, his eyes earnest. "You've been so kind." Susan hesitated, but the look in his eyes, gratitude, mixed with something deeper, a need to give back, made her accept the money. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't felt in a long time. She watched as Harold disappeared into the building, the doorman closing the door behind him. For a moment, she stood there, feeling the weight of the money in her hand, the night suddenly quieter around her. Then, with a sigh, she turned and walked away, blending back into the shadows of the city, leaving the warmth of that brief encounter behind. The morning came too soon, with the gray light of dawn creeping through the cracks in the old warehouse windows where Susan had found a few hours of fitful sleep. She stretched, her muscles stiff from the hard floor, and stepped out onto the street. The city was waking up, people rushing past her on their way to work, barely noticing her existence. As she walked towards the park, hoping to scrounge up a bit of breakfast, a man appeared from the crowd, his stride purposeful as he approached her. He was in his 40s, with a sharp, clean-cut look that screamed business. His eyes, however, were kind, and they softened as they locked onto hers. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Are you Susan?" She froze, instinctively wary. Who's asking? I'm Thomas Hargrove. My father is Harold Hargrove, the man you helped last night. The name hit her like a gust of wind, sweeping away the remnants of sleep. She studied him, looking for any sign of deception, but his face was open, sincere. How did you find me? She asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Thomas gave a small, weary smile. My father remembered your name. I asked around, and someone at the shelter mentioned seeing you in this area. Susan relaxed a little but stayed on guard. Is he okay? Yes, he's fine, thanks to you. Thomas hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. He has early-stage dementia. Some days are better than others, but last night he got disoriented. Your kindness meant a lot to him, more than you know. She nodded, unsure of what to say. The man seemed genuine, but she had learned the hard way not to trust too easily. Thomas cleared his throat, shifting slightly. Look, I know this is sudden, but I wanted to talk to you about something. My father was deeply moved by what you did, and frankly, so was I. I've been looking for someone to help care for him, someone who's patient, understanding. I'd like to offer you a job as his live-in caretaker. The words hung in the air between them, and Susan felt her breath catch. A job. A place to stay. It sounded too good to be true, almost like a dream she had given up on long ago. I don't know, she started, her mind racing. The idea was tempting, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be a catch. Why me? You don't even know me. Thomas held her gaze, his expression earnest. Because my father trusts you. He's a good judge of character, and I believe in giving people a chance. I'm willing to take that chance with you, if you're willing to take it with us. Susan looked down at the ground, her thoughts a jumble of doubts and what-ifs. It was more than just a job, it was a lifeline. But could she really step into this man's life, with all the uncertainty that came with it? After a long pause, she met his eyes again. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not exactly reliable. Thomas smiled, a hint of understanding in his eyes. We all have our pasts, Susan. What matters is what you choose to do now. If you're willing to give it a try, so am I. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and Susan felt something inside her shift. It wasn't just about the job, it was about a chance to start over, to prove to herself that she was more than the sum of her circumstances. I'll think about it, she finally said, still guarded but with a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. Thomas nodded, pulling a card from his pocket and handing it to her. Take your time. Here's my number. If you decide you're interested, call me. No pressure. She took the card, feeling its smooth surface between her fingers, and watched as Thomas turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of people. For a moment, she stood there, rooted to the spot, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. Finally, she slipped the card into her pocket and continued her walk, the city around her still buzzing with life. But now, there was a new thought circling in her mind, one that wouldn't let her go. Maybe, just maybe, this was the chance she'd been waiting for. Susan settled into her new life at Harold's home with a sense of cautious optimism. The house was warm and comfortable, a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving streets she had known for so long. Her days quickly found a rhythm: morning tea, long walks in the garden, and afternoons spent listening to Harold's stories, some clear and sharp, others muddled by time and the creeping fog of his illness. She found herself growing fond of the old man, his gentle demeanor a far cry from the brusque, hurried strangers she had grown used to encountering. Yet, as the days passed, Susan began to notice something unsettling. Harold, usually so pleasant and composed, would occasionally drift into conversations about a woman named Lillian. The first time it happened, he had been describing an old vacation spot when he suddenly mentioned Lillian's laughter echoing through the trees. His voice had softened, his eyes growing distant, as if he were seeing her in the room with them. But when Susan asked who Lillian was, Harold blinked in confusion, as if the name meant nothing to him. It happened again a few days later. They were in the living room, Harold holding an old wooden box that he kept on a shelf by the fireplace. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the carvings on the lid. "Lillian used to love this box," he murmured, more to himself than to Susan. "She always said it held our most precious memories." Susan watched him carefully, a knot forming in her stomach. She had never heard Thomas mention anyone named Lillian, and there were no photographs of her in the house, at least none that she had seen. When she gently asked Harold who Lillian was, his mood darkened. He set the box down abruptly, his fingers curling into fists as a shadow passed over his face. "I don't want to talk about it," he muttered, his voice tight with emotion. "Just leave it be." From that moment on, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from her, some piece of Harold's past that was too painful for him to face. She tried to bring it up casually with Thomas, but he brushed her off, insisting that Harold's memory wasn't what it used to be, and that it was probably just a name from some old story long forgotten. But Susan wasn't so sure. There was something about the way Harold spoke of Lillian, something in his eyes that spoke of deep, unresolved sorrow. And the box, always the box. He seemed to cling to it, sometimes holding it close to his chest as if it were a lifeline, other times setting it aside with a haunted look, as if it contained all the secrets he wished to forget. That night, when the house had finally settled into a quiet stillness, Susan couldn't resist the pull of curiosity any longer. She waited until she was sure Harold was asleep, his soft snores echoing down the hallway, and then she crept into the living room. The box sat where Harold had left it, its polished wood gleaming faintly in the dim light. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the history it seemed to carry. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but as she examined the box more closely, she noticed something she hadn't before, a small, almost imperceptible groove along the bottom edge. Her heart began to race as she gently pressed against it, and with a soft click, a hidden compartment slid open. Inside, nestled against the velvet lining, was a photograph and a delicate silver locket. Susan carefully lifted the photograph into the light. It was of Harold, much younger, standing beside a beautiful woman with dark hair and a radiant smile. They looked happy, their arms wrapped around each other, the kind of happiness that comes from a deep, enduring bond. The back of the photograph was inscribed with a single line, "Harold and Lillian, summer of '63. Susan's breath caught in her throat. This was Lillian, the woman who haunted Harold's memories. The woman who was clearly once the center of his world, yet who had been erased from his present. She set the photograph down and picked up the locket, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside, engraved with meticulous care, were the initials H and L. She stared at the locket, feeling the weight of it in her palm, the significance of the initials etched into the metal. This was no ordinary keepsake. It was a piece of Harold's heart, a connection to a past he could not let go, and one that had been hidden away for reasons Susan could only begin to guess. As she carefully placed the items back into the compartment, closing it with a soft snap, Susan knew that whatever secrets Harold was holding on to, they were not just his own. They were entwined with the lives of those around him, and perhaps, they were the key to understanding the man who had become such an important part of her life. The tension in the house had been simmering for days, an undercurrent that Susan couldn't ignore. Harold's mentions of Lillian were becoming more frequent, his moods more erratic whenever her name slipped from his lips. The discovery of the photograph and locket weighed heavily on Susan's mind. She knew she needed to do something, to get to the bottom of who Lillian really was, and why her memory seemed to haunt Harold so deeply. One evening, after Harold had gone to bed, Susan decided it was time to confront Thomas. She found him in his study, the room dimly lit by a single lamp on the desk. Papers were scattered across the surface, but Thomas wasn't reading them. He sat with his head in his hands, lost in thought. "Thomas," Susan began, her voice steady but tinged with concern, "I need to talk to you about something." He looked up, his expression guarded. "What is it?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's about your father, and Lillian." His reaction was immediate, a flicker of something dark crossing his face, before he quickly masked it. "What about her?" Susan reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph, placing it on the desk in front of him. "I found this in a hidden compartment in your father's box, along with a locket. He's been mentioning her more and more, and every time he does, he gets so upset. I think he's carrying a lot of pain about her. Maybe we should talk to him, help him make peace with whatever happened." Thomas's eyes narrowed as he looked at the photograph, his jaw tightening. "Where did you find this?" His voice was sharp, the edge in it startling. "I told you, it was in the box," Susan replied, surprised by the sudden change in his demeanor. "I thought it might help him if—" "You thought wrong?" Thomas snapped, standing abruptly and pacing the room. "This is none of your concern, Susan. You shouldn't have gone through his things." "I didn't mean to invade his privacy," she said, trying to stay calm despite the growing unease in her chest. "I just want to help. He's suffering, Thomas. Can't you see that?" Thomas stopped pacing, turning to face her with a look of cold fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Leave it alone." "I mean it, Susan. Drop it." His harsh tone left her reeling, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. This was not the reaction she had expected. She had hoped for understanding, maybe even relief that someone else was sharing the burden. But instead, she was met with hostility, a side of Thomas she had never seen before. "I'm just trying to understand," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why won't you talk to me about this?" "Because it's not your place," Thomas said, his voice lowering but still laced with anger. "You're here to care for my father, not to dig into our past." The words stung, and Susan felt her face flush with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. Before she could say anything else, a soft sound interrupted them, a shuffle, then a faint moan from the doorway. They both turned to see Harold standing there, his eyes wide and filled with confusion. "Lillian. Where's Lillian?" he murmured, his voice trembling. Susan's heart broke at the sight of him, so vulnerable and lost. She started toward him, but Thomas was faster. He crossed the room in a few quick strides, gently guiding his father back toward the hallway. "Dad, you need to rest," Thomas said, his tone gentler now but firm. "Let's get you back to bed." But Harold resisted, his grip tightening on Thomas's arm. "No, I need to talk to her. I need to tell her," his voice cracked, his eyes brimming with tears. "It wasn't my fault, Tommy. It wasn't my fault." Susan felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What wasn't his fault? What had happened between Harold and Lillian that caused him so much anguish? Before she could process it, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial, quickly preparing a syringe. "This will help you sleep, Dad," he said softly, his hand steady as he administered the sedative. Harold's protests faded as the drug took effect, his body going limp in Thomas's arms. Susan watched, her stomach churning, as Thomas carried his father back to his room, leaving her standing alone in the study. The house was eerily quiet after they left, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Susan's mind raced, replaying the scene over and over. Thomas's anger, Harold's desperation, the swift way Thomas had sedated him, it all felt wrong, as if there was a story she wasn't being told, a truth buried beneath layers of pain and secrecy. Susan knew she was treading dangerous ground, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had come into this house to help, to be a comfort to a man in need. But now, she wasn't sure who needed saving more, Harold from his memories, or herself from whatever it was she had just stumbled into. Susan couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest like a heavy stone. The confrontation with Thomas had left her rattled, and Harold's broken plea haunted her thoughts. She knew there was more to the story, something that Thomas was desperately trying to keep buried. But what? Over the next few days, Susan began to piece together fragments of the past. She started with the obvious, the local library, where she spent hours combing through old newspapers, searching for any mention of Lillian. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. The headline was buried deep in the archives, a small article from over 40 years ago, young woman vanishes after dispute with brother. Susan's breath caught as she read through the details. Lillian Hargrove, a local schoolteacher, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances after a heated argument with her older brother, Harold. The article described how the family had been torn apart by the incident, with no sign of Lillian ever being found. There were no follow-up articles, no mention of a body or any further investigation. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Susan's heart pounded as she absorbed the information. This was what Harold had been trying to forget, what Thomas had been so determined to hide. She couldn't imagine the guilt Harold must have carried all these years, believing he was somehow responsible for his sister's disappearance. And Thomas, how long had he been shielding his father from the truth? Armed with the knowledge she had uncovered, Susan returned to the house, her mind made up. She had to confront Thomas again, but this time, she needed answers. She found him in the living room, his gaze distant as he stared out the window. "Thomas, we need to talk," she said, her voice steady but firm. He turned to her, a flash of apprehension in his eyes. "What is it now, Susan?" She didn't waste any time. "I know about Lillian. I found the newspaper article about her disappearance." Thomas's face paled, his expression hardening as he realized she wasn't going to let this go. "I told you to leave it alone." "I can't," Susan replied, her voice rising with emotion. "Harold is suffering, and I don't think you understand how much this is affecting him. He needs to know what happened to his sister. He deserves the truth." Thomas took a deep breath, his jaw clenched as he tried to maintain control. "The truth? You think you know the truth, because of some old article?" He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Lillian didn't just disappear, Susan. She died. She died in a car accident that night, and Harold, he was the one driving." Susan felt the room tilt, the weight of Thomas's words crashing down on her. "What?" "She ran out after the argument," Thomas continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Harold went after her, trying to bring her back. They argued some more, and she got in the car with him. They were both upset, not thinking clearly. There was a sharp turn, the car skidded off the road and into the river." He paused, his eyes darkening as he relived the moment. "Harold managed to get out, but Lillian, she was trapped. By the time help arrived, it was too late. He's never been able to forgive himself. The shock of it, he blocked it out, buried the memory so deep that he convinced himself she just disappeared. I've spent my life protecting him from that memory, from the truth that he couldn't bear to face." Susan stood there, stunned into silence. The tragedy was almost too much to comprehend. All this time, Harold had been living with a guilt so profound that it had fractured his mind, leaving him with only fragments of what had happened. "But he deserves to know," Susan finally said, her voice trembling with the weight of her conviction. "He can't heal if he doesn't face the truth." Thomas's eyes flashed with anger, his composure cracking. "And what do you think that will accomplish? Do you think telling him that he killed his own sister will bring him peace? It will destroy him, Susan. It will break whatever's left of him." "It's not about what it will do to him," Susan shot back, her voice rising. "It's about giving him the chance to make peace with his past. He's been living in a nightmare, Thomas. Don't you see that? You're trying to protect him, but all you're doing is keeping him trapped in his own guilt." Thomas's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He looked at Susan, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "I've been trying to protect him all my life. I don't know how to do anything else." Susan stepped closer, her voice softening. "Sometimes, the best way to protect someone is to help them face the truth. You've carried this burden for so long, but it's not yours to bear alone. Harold deserves the chance to find peace, and so do you." For a long moment, Thomas said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then, with a slow, reluctant nod, he looked up at Susan, the weight of his decision clear in his eyes. "Okay," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We'll tell him. But God help us both if this destroys him." The house was cloaked in a heavy silence as Susan prepared herself for the task ahead. After her confrontation with Thomas, she had spent the night wrestling with the weight of what she had learned, the tragic truth about Lillian, and Harold's unwitting role in it. But there was still one piece missing, one final thread that needed to be pulled to unravel the full story. The next morning, Susan set out to find that thread. She had remembered a name from one of Harold's rare, lucid stories, Margaret, a childhood friend of Lillian's. If anyone could help her put the final pieces together, it would be Margaret. With some effort, Susan managed to locate her, a spry woman in her 70s who still lived in the small town where she and Lillian had grown up. Margaret invited Susan into her modest home, where the scent of fresh tea and baked scones filled the air. She had aged gracefully, her hair silver and her eyes bright with the wisdom of years. As they sat together in the cozy living room, Susan explained why she had come, gently broaching the subject of Lillian's tragic death. Margaret's expression grew somber, her gaze drifting to a framed photo of a young Lillian on the mantelpiece. "I still remember that day like it was yesterday," she said softly. "Lillian was so full of life, always with a smile on her face, always looking forward to the future. But that night, everything changed." Susan listened intently as Margaret recounted the events of that fateful evening, confirming what Susan already knew about the argument between Harold and Lillian, the car accident, and Lillian's untimely death. But then Margaret hesitated, as if debating whether to share something more. "There's something else," Margaret finally said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Something that never made it into the newspapers, something the family kept hidden. Lillian was pregnant when she died." The words hit Susan like a blow, knocking the breath out of her. "Pregnant?" she echoed, barely able to process the revelation. Margaret nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. She was going to tell Harold that night, after the argument. She was terrified of what he might say, but she loved him, and she wanted him to be a part of her child's life. But she never got the chance. After the accident, the doctors managed to save the baby. A little boy. But the family was too shattered to care for him, so he was adopted by a distant relative on Lillian's mother's side. The child was never told about his true parentage. I suppose they thought it was better that way. Susan sat in stunned silence, the room spinning around her. A child. Harold had a son, a living connection to the sister he had lost. The implications were overwhelming, and she couldn't imagine how Harold would react to such a revelation. "Does Harold know?" Susan asked, though she already suspected the answer. Margaret shook her head. "No, he never knew. After the accident, he was in such a state that his mind just shut down. He blocked out everything about that night, including Lillian's pregnancy. The family decided it was best to let him believe she had simply disappeared. It was easier for him to live with that than to face the truth." Susan's heart ached for Harold, for the years of pain and guilt he had endured without ever knowing the full story. But now that she knew, she couldn't keep it from him. He deserved to know the truth, all of it. Returning to the house, Susan felt the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her. She found Harold in the garden, sitting quietly on a bench, his hands folded in his lap. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the flowers, a stark contrast to the storm that was brewing in Susan's heart. "Harold," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "there's something I need to tell you. It's about Lillian." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and hope. "Lillian. I tried to save her, Susan. I really did." Susan sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his. "I know you did. But there's more to the story, something you don't remember." Slowly, carefully, Susan told him everything she had learned from Margaret, the argument, the accident, and finally, the child that had been born in the aftermath. Harold listened in silence, his face pale and drawn as the truth washed over him. When she finished, Harold's hands were trembling, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "She was pregnant? And the child, he survived?" Susan nodded, tears brimming in her own eyes. "Yes, Harold. You have a son. He's alive." Harold's face crumpled as the enormity of it all sank in. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing, the sound of decades of grief and guilt pouring out of him. Susan wrapped her arms around him, holding him as he wept, her own tears falling freely. For what felt like hours, they sat together, the sun slowly dipping below the horizon. When Harold finally lifted his head, his eyes were red and swollen, but there was a new light in them, a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. "I always thought it was my fault," he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "But now I know. She left something behind, didn't she? Something good." Susan nodded, squeezing his hand. "She did. And if you want to, we can find him. We can bring him back into your life." Harold looked at her, his gaze steady for the first time in years. "I want to know him, Susan. I want to make things right." Susan didn't waste any time once Harold made his wishes clear. The days that followed were filled with phone calls, letters, and endless online searches. It wasn't easy, decades had passed, and records were scattered, some lost entirely. But Susan was relentless, driven by the need to fulfill Harold's final wish. After weeks of searching, Susan finally found what she was looking for: a name, an address, and a life that had unknowingly been intertwined with Harold's all along. The man's name was Daniel, and he lived just a few towns over, a quiet man in his late 40s who had built a life for himself, blissfully unaware of the family he had been separated from. Susan approached the reunion with a mix of trepidation and hope. She knew that this could either be the healing moment Harold needed or something that might further complicate his fragile state. But Harold was resolute. He needed, to meet the son he never knew. When the day came, Susan accompanied Harold to Daniel's modest home. The air was thick with anticipation as they stood on the porch, Harold's hand trembling slightly as he reached for the doorbell. Susan gave him a reassuring smile, and he nodded, steeling himself for whatever was to come. The door opened, and Daniel stood before them, a tall man with kind eyes that mirrored Harold's. There was an uncanny resemblance, the same lines etched into their faces, the same thoughtful expression. For a moment, no one spoke, the weight of the moment rendering them all speechless. "Daniel?" Harold's voice was a whisper, thick with emotion. "My name is Harold. I believe I'm your father." Daniel's eyes widened, shock and confusion crossing his features. "My father?" He glanced at Susan, who gave him a gentle nod, then back at Harold. "I was adopted. I never knew." "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," Susan said softly, stepping forward to explain. She carefully recounted the story, how Lillian had died and how Harold had been unaware of Daniel's existence until recently. She spoke with the same gentle precision she'd used when telling Harold, her words wrapping around the delicate truth. Daniel listened intently, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding, then finally, to something softer, something like acceptance. When Susan finished, a heavy silence hung between them, as if the world had paused, waiting for the next move. I don't know what to say," Daniel finally murmured, his voice raw with emotion. "This is a lot." Harold stepped closer, his old eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to meet you, to see you, to know you exist." Daniel's gaze softened, and in that moment, something seemed to click into place, a connection that had been missing for so long. He stepped forward, hesitating only for a second before wrapping his arms around Harold in a tentative, then firm, embrace. Harold's breath caught in his throat as he clung to his son, a lifetime of regret and longing pouring out in silent tears. The reunion was everything Susan had hoped for, and more. Over the next few weeks, Daniel visited often, getting to know the father he had never met and the brother he never knew he had. There were awkward moments, sure, and times when the reality of their connection seemed almost too surreal to grasp, but the bond between them grew stronger with each visit. As their family came together, Harold's health began to decline more rapidly. The doctors were gentle but firm, he didn't have much time left. But instead of despair, there was a calmness in Harold that no one had seen before. He had found the peace he had been searching for all these years. One crisp autumn afternoon, surrounded by his sons and Susan, Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep. There was no pain, no fear, just the quiet serenity of a man who had finally found closure. In the days that followed, the house felt both emptier and fuller at the same time. The loss of Harold was profound, but the family he had left behind was stronger than ever. Thomas and Daniel, once strangers, now brothers, found comfort in each other's company. And Susan, who had once been an outsider, was now an integral part of their lives. On the day of Harold's memorial, Thomas approached Susan with a quiet determination. "You've done so much for us, Susan. We can't imagine our lives without you. We want you to stay, not just as someone who helped us through a difficult time, but as part of our family." Daniel nodded in agreement, his eyes warm with gratitude. "You're not just a caretaker, Susan. You're family. Please stay with us." Susan felt tears welling up, but this time, they were tears of joy. For so long, she had been searching for a place where she belonged, a place where she was needed and loved. And now, she had found it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I'd like that very much." And so, Susan's journey came full circle. She had found not only stability and security but a true sense of belonging. In the end, it wasn't just Harold who had found peace, it was all of them, united by the threads of a shared past and the promise of a new beginning.